Hello and welcome to the Goldfinger Report. We are here today with Veronica Wright and Michael Gallipo. If I said it correctly, welcome to the show. I'm just going to be holding space, and I would like Veronica and Michael to lead the show and tell the people out there what it is that you do and what the people should know, the public should know. Thank you.
Yeah. So Mikey, you want me to start or you want to start?
You could go first.
Mikey graciously invited me to be a part of the Goldfinger show because I have a nonprofit called the National Coalition for Drug Legalization. And the mission of this nonprofit is to advance the conversation about drug legalization through community service and research. And next month, on April 27th, we're going to be hosting a public forum on drug legalization. And Mikey's going to be on the panel. And it's going to be an excellent panel. It's going to be at Johns Hopkins University with Dr. Carl Hart, who is a neuroscientist who has, in his latest book, Drug Use for Grownups, he discusses his research on the effects of drug abuse on the brain, but then he openly comes out and says that he uses drugs. And we have Billy Murphy, who is a very respected lawyer in Baltimore who represented Freddie Gray, and he's going to talk about drug legalization from a racial justice standpoint. And we also have Jacob Rich from the Reason Foundation, two professors from Johns Hopkins University, and like I said, again, Mikey G, he's going to be there to share his experiences, his lived experience with drugs. And I started this nonprofit because I was somebody who I didn't even support marijuana legalization as late as 2017. And when my cousin passed away, my cousin Dwayne, he made me change my perspective on our current drug policy because he was someone who he was born addicted to drugs. He went to prison for drugs, and he died an alcoholic. And when at his funeral, I met his son for the first time. And when I met his son Desmond, there was no question this was Dwayne's son. I mean, Desmond got Dwayne all the way down to his fingertips. But anyways, I made a commitment to be in Desmond's life because I didn't want him to live a life like his dad. Dwayne wasn't always present in Desmond's life because of his struggle with drug abuse. He went to prison, which is we should not be criminalizing drug use and people struggle with drugs. And so that felony on his record really prevented him from being able to live a meaningful and substantive life. And I made Desmond make a promise that if you graduate from high school, you can come live with me, provided that you work and go to school. So he lives with me. He kept up his end of the bargain. But when he came to live with me, it was a struggle. He came to me when he was 19. He's 22 now. And it was like, I never had kids. So it was like having a son. And I'm having to tell him, let me see your grades. Did you turn in your homework? Did you go to class? Wash your clothes, take a bath, brush your teeth. I turned into Mama Bear. And I'm just like, why couldn't Dwayne be here to see his son graduate from high school, but be here to just be there to teach his son these things that I'm doing right now is because he went to prison and we don't treat drug users right. We don't show drug users love and compassion. And so I said, no, I got to change the narrative on this. And so I started a nonprofit, and the goal was to not only advance the conversation about drug legalization, but I had wanted to do research on the industrial uses of cocaine. And that's how I found Mikey G. So, someone connected me, a mutual friend connected me to Mikey. And he was very nice. And he was doing a lot of research at the time with University of Rhode Island or something like that. And then for a while, I didn't hear from Mikey. And then he calls me out of the blue and he says, you know what, Veronica, I know that you want to do research on the coca leaf, cocaine, but I met someone that we can do research on the coca leaf, which is a derivative of cocaine. That's where cocaine comes from. And I was excited. And so we have been friends ever since and have been working together. And I don't know how many years ago was that? How many years ago was that, Mikey?
I think we first met like 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh my God. I can't believe it.
Yeah,
So just
2017, 2018, somewhere in
so
there, and 2022 now.
I can't believe it. And so now last year, he came together with me and some other people to write a drug legalization handbook. I'm so proud of this handbook. We have the Reason Foundation is supposed to publish it, and so we're all being patient. But this handbook kind of sets the legal framework as to how to legalize all drugs, not just marijuana. And hopefully we can move forward with a drug legalization pilot study in the state of Maryland. So I'm gonna hand it over to Mikey G.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. So many folks know me as Mikey G. My full name is Michael Gallipo. I'm the National Cannabis and Psychedelics Liaison for the Urban Survivors Union. And for folks who aren't familiar with that name, I would hope that after this episode, you become more familiar. But to be short, we are the National Drug Users Union. We represent the national platform for the drug user voice. And we're an organization that's comprised of primarily organizations. So these are local and state level drug user unions. So these are grassroots community organizations. Many of them have developed beyond informal organizations into actual service providers, licensed programs, public health programs, providing essential testing services, syringe exchange services, and now most recently, drug testing and checking services. Because one of the things that's been a primary issue and why drug legalization is so important is that there is an issue with the drug supply in terms of quality control. People who use drugs in the United States, because drugs and their use is criminalized, so is their manufacturing and distribution. There are no consumer protections, basic human rights for people who consume substances that have a robust history of consumption throughout the entirety of recorded global history. So I reference that because our recent foray into prohibition is a very recent development and experiment. And it's an experiment that we departed into that has borne extreme social costs. One of the difficulties when it comes to substance use is how to provide people with access to substance use without increasing the harms in a public health sense, right? We know that drugs have a profound effect on the developing brain. And to provide a little bit more clarity, Veronica, around people being born with drug dependence, we know that with current science, and this is one of the real challenges with drug legalization, is the amount of misinformation or the very high level of nuanced information that is out there to understand what the current understanding of substance use looks like, right? So people can be born drug dependent, but they cannot be born with an addiction. And the reason for that being is because an addiction has a very specific behavioral component that is not found in dependent babies. They haven't developed those more advanced functions to engage in patterns of drug-seeking behaviors.
Mhm.
So we know that infants are born alcohol and drug dependent. almost all of them are able to enter a period of abstinence within the first, 3 months to 6 months of life, depending on the extent of the dependency, by being able to address the withdrawal symptoms, and then eventually they're able to enter a period of abstinence before the more advanced cognitive functions have actually begun to present themselves and develop. So that's one example of many types of misinformation that informs our cultural narrative. And
Yes,
the
and that,
biggest barrier that we have to drug legalization is not the science, is not the policy. I mean, we have experts like you mentioned, Veronica, we're publishing a drug legalization handbook to propose a framework. It's just one of many frameworks. Other groups have done this work in other countries where drugs are currently legalized and regulated throughout the world. But our culture finds it very difficult to accept the use of drugs
Mhm.
because of what we were all taught about what drugs meant. I mean, I think back to the quote from Ronald Reagan. The drug problem was as un-American as it could get. And that was exemplary of a lot of the public discourse and the education that was put out there, that this was a danger, it was a threat, that this needed to be addressed, that Nixon had declared a formal war on drugs. And so our public policy has emerged in two disconnected branches. We
Mhm.
have the paramilitary response of interdiction, and we have the public health response of our CDC and our public health departments. And the two of them continue to butt heads. We know that science is driving our response in a different direction, and yet our culture is deeply ingrained in this idea of public safety that is driven by a highly controlled system of prohibition that is enforced by a paramilitary police force.
So can I interject? Yeah, I'm so glad that you corrected me. Drug dependent. I had to get away from saying addictive, but now you said, and I know that Todd is the interviewer, but drugs are decriminalized in many countries across the world, but nowhere is drug legalized. So we're going for something that's big, you know. Uh, w- so let me break down the difference between drug decriminalization and legalization. With decriminalization, like it is in Oregon and Portugal, you can have a small possession, a small amount in your possession, maybe like 5 grams or less, and the police find that on you and not go to prison because it was decriminalized. But you can still go to prison if the laws say that you can't have more than that. And even with decriminalization, and this is something that I have a conversation with Luis all the time, and Luis is she leads the Urban Survivors Union, that decriminalization does nothing to protect the drug supply. It does nothing to protect the drug supply. There's no, like Mikey G said earlier, there's no standards for quality control. There's no standards for purity and potency. So when drug users buy something from someone, there's a lot of trust there that what they're getting is what they think they're getting, you know? Um, and so I just wanted to mention that part right there. Todd, you have any questions for us?
Absolutely. Fentanyl and opioids, what are they, and what do we need to know? What does the public need to know about these?
I'll let Mikey take that one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica. Well, it's important to point out that nearly all of these substances, right? So in a prohibition system, we have this really bizarre classification system that exists because of the Controlled Substances Act. So we have a scheduling system. So there is legal use of cocaine, for example, in the United States currently for medical purposes. Now, we could expand those medical purposes. That would be one avenue to legalization, would be to expand medicalization, which is much what cannabis has done. to pave the way for broader recreational legalization, right? So that's one avenue of legalization. We also know that up until about the 1950s, 60s, even 70s, that heroin was prescribed and actually still is prescribed today in Switzerland. So there is a legal framework for a heroin-assisted treatment program. They've also piloted projects in Vancouver, Canada, that still operate to this day, administering heroin in a legal environment. So there are very few drugs on the market today that exist without some precedent for a form of legal access, however restrictive that might be. Fentanyl is no exception to that list. Fentanyl is actually a very widely used analgesic opioid that is typically used in post-acute care following some type of extreme event or major surgery, and is available by prescription. The kind of more widely used formulation of fentanyl is through a dermal patch, which I believe has contributed to some degree of misinformation and hysteria around fentanyl and the dangers of touching or absorbing fentanyl. Again, this is where bad information being proliferated through the media can be really unhelpful to make a case for drug legalization. But fentanyl is used widely in acute care settings. And in fact, just a few years ago, there was a new formulation of fentanyl that's probably equivalent in strength to carfentanil called sufentanil that was approved by the FDA for emergency care situations, mostly with wounded soldiers in combat situations that needed a severe kind of a post-acute type of medication. So there are existing legalities for nearly all of these products. The problem is that these products aren't being provided in what's called a person-centered manner. So meaning we don't recognize the agency and the autonomy of an individual who's using those substances to determine when and how it's best appropriate for them to use those substances to get the benefits that they desire from them. We also have a very critical gap in our education about these types of controlled substances.
Yeah.
Because we've done, and Carl Hart talks about this in his book, which is why it's so great he's going to be on our panel, that there is a dearth of research in terms of the benefits of many of these types of controlled substances. Coca is no exception. One of the things that really struck me as remarkable when I started diving into what work had been done to examine coca and its medicinal benefits, that despite well over 10,000 years of anecdotal history of it being used to treat respiratory illnesses, to alleviate altitude sickness in indigenous populations, we knew it had obvious self-reported medicinal benefits. There had been absolutely no basic biological research done on the plant itself to examine it for medicinal properties or benefits. And so the only part of the plant that had ever been studied extensively at all was cocaine, and very little research has been done to show how cocaine can benefit patient populations outside of its already existing approved medicinal use through the Controlled Substances Act under the FDA regulation model. And that's a broader topic that I'll just raise as something to consider, that not all legalization is equal, right? And so we know that in terms of different models of regulation and business development, we have two kind of dominant federal landscape models. We have the highly restrictive model of the pharmaceutical industry, which is product approval through the FDA, which requires extensive clinical trials and lots of long years of reviews and meta-analyses done on randomized controlled trials. And so that process takes a long time, and it ends up being very exclusive in terms of who has access to distribute and manufacture these products. So those businesses are not historically businesses that are predominantly held by people who have been disadvantaged by the drug war.
Mhm.
The other model is an ATF, so alcohol, tobacco, and firearms model of regulation. And if we look at, in poor communities, especially poor communities of color, I know many cities that I've lived in, it was kind of a common adage that you would have like the bodega or the tobacco seller. You'd have, and oftentimes they'd have a liquor license. They could sell alcohol or beer or even liquor. And then the local liquor store and the local gun shop and the local pawn shop. And none of those businesses were owned generally by large national or international corporate entities. Most of these endpoints of distribution were owned by local proprietors. So many of those resources stayed in local communities, it recirculated in local communities, and it kept more of the resources in those communities within those communities where they're needed. And that looks more like the model of economic distribution of the illicit economy. A lot of the money circulates in local economies. There's a fraction of that money that gets outsourced to manufacturing, largely in other countries that are also very underprivileged. And so the cost of manufacturing is quite low. The farmers actually see a very small percentage of the total economic value of cocaine, as an example. Because of the expansion happening across the trade network that it takes to get those products here. A legalization system would remove a lot of those middlemen, allow us to build trade equity with farmers, to allow us to use that to insert fair trade practices, which are common in the food industry, to uplift people who are living in poverty in other partner countries that we want to increase trade security and also increase, drug and military security. They would be generous participants if they're going to directly benefit from those systems. And then that savings can then get passed on into communities that people are directly impacted and have ample opportunities for proprietors to be able to make money in their own local communities, pay tax in those local communities, and recirculate those resources in local communities where they're also doing purchasing and redistributing that economic. And that's a healthy system of economics. So I just want to point out that these models are not equal in my eyes in terms of the economic value to people who've been harmed by the drug war. And so I just want us to be thoughtful and careful in how we think about legalization. Is not just a one track conversation. There are multiple opportunities and also multiple threats that we need to think about if we want the model of legalization that we implement to be successful and have the desired effect.
So, people always, and that's an excellent question that you asked, Todd, about, what is fentanyl? It's a type of opioid, okay? But a lot of people put so much emphasis on, the opioid overdose crisis that it kind of it doesn't lend them to support for legalization of all drugs, because I get that all the time. Why would you want to legalize drugs and we're in an opioid overdose crisis? And this goes back to what Mikey was saying. There's no system for quality control. When people go and buy drugs, cocaine, for example, oftentimes it has fentanyl in it and people don't know, or maybe they do know, but they don't know how much. And the person making it is not, following standards for purity and potency. So, yeah, if you want to lower the opioid overdoses, then you're going to have to legalize and regulate drugs. Yeah.
That's great. That's wonderful. I want to say that, during the Nixon era, this is when, for me, I mean, I wasn't alive then, but what I remember from the Nixon era was so many bad things happened, and we're still feeling the residual effects of that era in so many ways. And I just want to say that I think it's wonderful what the both of you are doing, and what you're able to tell the audience today, because these are so valuable. These are such valuable words for the audience to hear. and I applaud you and thank you for being on the program. If there's anything else you'd like to say, you have the floor, both of you.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to add a little bit about, like, just to give a primer on the history
Sure.
and talk about that Nixon era,
Yes.
because it's important to frame the context of the drug war and the policies that resulted from it, right? The really harmful actions of prohibition were not designed with the interest of public health in mind, right? We came from a long-standing legacy and history of both overt and covert racism here in the
Yes.
United States. We've also had a legacy of exploitation and slave labor that goes back all the way to the arrival of the Europeans here. Many of the Europeans themselves arrived as indentured servants, and so even Europeans themselves were not entirely immune to that. And it's important to point out that, like, as we move past the Reformation era into the human and civil rights movement of the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act was passed. A number of different types of civil rights legislation and amendments were actually drafted and written into the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, had a very large loophole that needs to be closed. And it allowed people who were convicted of a crime to legally be allowed to be treated as slaves. And it was this loophole, in combination with the drastic upswing in human rights and the pushback from communities who felt like they were losing power in terms of their presence in the American government, to start to target both the anti-war movement that consisted largely of the hippies and the college students who were, getting together in large social gatherings and demanding, justice for what was going on with the war in Vietnam, and all of the dirty dealing that was being done at that time by the DEA. If you haven't seen there's a really good docuseries on Amazon Prime on America's War on Drugs that goes over this in great detail, gives a really good chronology of the issues. But you can see how the federal government pivoted now that they could no longer overtly discriminate against people based on their race. They had to find other ways to continue that legacy of discrimination. And so the war on drugs came as a direct follow-up to the human and civil rights movement. And it became a new de facto way of segregating and criminalizing and incarcerating our way into the current crisis, the current cultural crisis that we're in now. And it was done for an enormous volume of profit for people who were actually actively involved in the political process. They've funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into political campaigns over decades. They represent some of the largest blocks of interest groups in the United States, the prison lobby, the police lobby. I mean, this is built so largely into the structure of our country. It's hard to imagine a country without these structures. And so I just want to point out that even though the issues, the human rights issues that underpin the drug user liberation movement and the case for drug legalization from a humanitarian perspective, there's also this really important legacy of racism and continued active harm against communities of people who have been disproportionately impacted based on their culture and their culture's beliefs and their practices. That there is a time, a reckoning in terms of restorative justice that's needed here in the United States. And so having these honest conversations where we can talk about and take responsibility at the collective level for the harms that have been done and be honest about the harm that's being done, and then go back to the drawing board and use science as a lens to guide our way forward. We want to be doing what's effective, not what feels morally righteous or upheld, because at the end of the day, we want to give every person the best chance of having success in their own version of the American dream, whatever that looks like. And they don't deserve to die alone in an alley with a needle in their arm because we refuse to provide them the most basic of rights and human services that every person should be afforded, in every country throughout the world. And that should be something that as a free country that we stand on, and we refuse to budge, because we believe in people having a quality of life, and that without it, there is no freedom.
Yes. Well said, Mikey.
Thank you. This is thank you so much, Veronica. You have the floor, please.
No, I mean, I couldn't say it better. I mean, the research, depending on who's doing the research, sometimes it will not be conducted with through a racial justice lens. That's like Mikey was saying, is fair and objective, because I looked on the Federal Bureau of Prisons website, tried to get understanding of who was going to prison and how many people were going to prison for drugs. And it was a high percentage. It was like 40%, almost 50%, with the majority of those individuals being Black and brown people. When I reached out to a lawyer who has his own nonprofit, and I would like to collaborate with him. He excellent person in the criminal justice reform space. He was like, no, that number is like 17%. And then I went back to Drug Policy Alliance website. I could have sworn that number was around 40 to 50% years prior, but now it's down to 20%. I mean, I'm gonna have to go back and do my homework. I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong, but you know, depending on who's funding the research, who's conducting the research, is going to change the narrative of of um, of how we move forward on our drug policy. It's going to influence how we think about drugs, and that's why I started my organization, because I wanted to do research that's going to be fair and objective and tell the truth, so that we can we can start freeing people. I mean, because when you look at mass incarceration, our drug laws play a big part in that. So the research needs to show the correlation. Mikey, what you think about that?
I think there's a really compelling case for, a critical consciousness lens of research design, which is taking into account, like, it can be very difficult to track substance related crime, because oftentimes people aren't just charged with drug possession. They might be just charged with paraphernalia. They might just be charged with a larceny 6 because they had to steal something to pay for their drugs. This is obviously a very complex and an incredibly important conversation. So I just want to encourage folks to tune in and join for our panel on April 27th from 6 to 7:30. We're going to be at Johns Hopkins University. And can they go on to the National Coalition for Drug Legalization social media to find out how to access that event, Veronica?
They can go to my website and send me an email. I'm bad. I don't have anything on there. I'm gonna put something on there today. That is so bad. I have it on my Twitter page.
Yeah.
It's
What
on
is that?
Eventbrite.
Just for the viewers to
It's
know where.
Veronica Wright 8.
WRIGHT, Veronica Wright 8.
Right, the number 8.
Yeah. And then I just wanted to also plug on April 20th, we're going to be having an event with the MSAM on 420 at Club Amazura in Jamaica, Queens. We're going to have Bob Marley's Original Wailers there, as well as his daughter is going to join us, in addition to Tony Touch and Grandmaster D and Louise Vincent, who's one of the founding members of the Urban Survivors Union and one of our national leaders. And then just one more thing I wanted to plug as well for here in New York State. We have the Treatment Not Jail campaign, which we're hoping to pass this year, which will expand judicial diversion to include mental health, functional impairments, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and widen eligibility criteria because of these issues with, the connection to drug-related crimes and whether or not people need help. We want to allow anybody who needs help to have access to judicial diversion. We'd love to see that happen all over the country. So look into our campaign. With that, I'll open it back up. Todd or Veronica, any last words you want to add?
Thank you, Todd.
Veronica,
Yeah.
please. Anything
Yeah,
you'd like to
thank-
say in closing?
No, I'm just thankful for the interview.
Thank you all so much for watching. God bless you all, and peace.
All right.